Welcome back, my friends, to AA Recovery Interviews. I'm your host, Howard L., and I'm an alcoholic. Sober since January 1st, 1988, one day at a time. I'm grateful you've joined us. AA Recovery Interviews is the podcast where Alcoholics Anonymous members from around the world share their timeless and extraordinary stories of experience, strength, and hope. When my guest, Beth F., finally got sober less than 4 years ago, she had made it to middle age as an active but functional alcoholic. She grew up in a family where alcoholism was present but largely unaddressed. Beth moved 9 times with her military family while still in elementary school, casting the die of a lonesome outsider. When she found alcohol early in her teens, Beth found the key to coping with life in good times and bad times. Though it took several decades to wear away the facade of normal or social drinker, Beth's ability to both work and raise a family ignored the facts of her burgeoning disease. As her functional alcoholism gave way to increased problem drinking, she knew that she had to make a change. Fortunately, her aunt was a longtime member of AA and accompanied Beth to her earliest AA meetings. The damage done by her years as an alcoholic was revealed in working the steps with a strong sponsor. She found the center of the herd and dug in, attending daily meetings, reading the big book, praying, and sponsoring other women. Working the program with her feet, Beth is also a trusted servant to the large and vibrant club she attends. Coming up on 4 years in July, Beth's experience as a sober member of AA is exemplary for those early in sobriety. Her inspiring words engender the reality of working a solid program by utilizing the simple set of tools available to all. So whether you're measuring your sobriety by weeks, months, or years, you are certain to get a lot out of the next hour of AA Recovery Interviews with my friend and AA sister, Beth F.
Hi, my name is Beth, and I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Beth, and that's the standard response heard around the world in AA meetings. We're friendly to people, and we welcome them into the rooms. I'm so glad that you're able to do this interview this morning with me, Beth, for the AA Recovery Interviews podcast.
I am honored to be asked. Thank you so much.
Well, I've been watching you over the years since you came into the program, since you came to this particular club, and I've admired the way you've carried yourself in your sobriety and watching you interact with other men and women especially. I knew I wanted to interview you because I knew you'd have some interesting, good things to say.
Well, thank you.
Now you're coming up on 4 years. What's your sobriety date?
My sobriety date is 7/21/21.
That was right in the middle of the COVID, wasn't it?
It was. The first year and a half I did Zoom meetings 6 days a week. And the only reason I didn't do them 7 days a week is that group didn't meet on Sundays.
So what was going on in your life on July 20th that would make you want to do an AA meeting the next day?
I experienced a real reality check in March of 2021. I had been in a marriage for 25 years with an alcoholic, and I knew he was an alcoholic when I married him, but didn't grasp the full extent of what that might mean. I was not bad, quote unquote, at that point, but the handwriting was already on the wall. And I realized on March 3rd that if I didn't make a change in my life, that I was not going to be here much longer. And I was choosing to remain on this planet. I had a daughter, I had a grandson and a granddaughter on the way, but I knew that whatever change I had to make had to be big. So I moved from Bryan, College Station, to Houston on April 1st and had planned to get sober, quote unquote, right away. But it took me a little while to get the courage to show up at a meeting. My aunt, who's been in the program for many years, she had 21 years, and then unfortunately she went out. She had 7 hard years, and she's back in. She's got 6 now. But she had invited me to a meeting since I moved to Houston. And I had said, I'm not ready yet, but please keep asking, because I knew that was what I needed. I just had to work up the courage. And finally she said, are you ready to go to a meeting? And I said, yes. I'm absolutely ready. And so she took me to a face-to-face meeting during COVID. It was a women's meeting on Saturday morning, and I did not have the courage to raise my hand and say it was my first meeting. There was a fellow woman who was there, and she had raised her hand, and I was so glad I had kept silent. I tend to be one of those retiring types, and I did not want that kind of attention. And I was so glad I that I had not raised my hand. But I got to experience what it felt like without them talking directly to me, and I got my first and only desire chip at that meeting. Up to this point, tomorrow is another day.
So your aunt had been in the program for 21 years, and do you know about her involvement with AA the entire time?
Yes, she was wonderful about sharing the program with the entire family. She had given me a lot of the literature. The big book that I use is the 3rd edition that she gave me all those years ago. I did not crack it open at that time or any time in the interim, but I hold it quite dear because it was a gift from her. But I had a lot of the women's Hazelden readings, and I used them. I used them often because they were so helpful. And then she provided a lot of education for the entire family. My father actually even came in just after she did, and he had over 20 years of sobriety before he went out.
He went out at 20, she went out at 21.
Yes, and she made it back, but unfortunately he did not.
He didn't. That's unfortunate.
It was quite a tragedy. December the 8th of 2008 was the day after the day that shall live in infamy in my life anyway. It was a horrendous event.
And of course you were still drinking at the time.
I was still drinking for many years after that.
What kind of things ran through your mind when you were sitting, let's say even at his funeral, or when you were around your aunt after you heard that she had slipped, after seeing their lives before slipping and then after, and in his case, after his death? And what were your feelings about your own situation?
I wasn't smart enough when my father passed, even at his funeral, to realize that could be me. Mm-hmm. I needed to live a lot more and to make a lot more mistakes at that time. I was mostly angry when he passed, and I couldn't even be angry for myself. I was angry for my daughter and my niece and nephew because of the legacy that leaves in a family. It was so hard. And I remained angry for a very, very long time. In fact, it has just been until this year that I have been able to lay down a lot of that and really have some compassion and some forgiveness, which without this program I would have never gotten to. But I had to work this for well over 3 years before that even entered my realm of possibility, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, that's a long time to be drinking. But the 3 years in which you've gotten what you need to get to be able to process all that, you've put in the effort and the work, because a lot of people never get to that, or if they get to it, it scares them off. Your father obviously was drinking while you were growing up.
Oh, yes.
And so what was your family of origin household like?
It was quite chaotic. My parents married very young. They were 17 and 18. I was born when my mother was 18 and my father was 19. Up to that point, they basically had nothing. They ate peanut butter and jelly sandwiches 5 days, 6 days a week, and for Saturday they had bologna sandwiches. I mean, they had very little. When I was born, they put me in a drawer because they couldn't afford a baby bed. And at that point, my father decided that he needed to get a degree. He joined the ROTC and got a degree, and then he went off to fight in the Vietnam War. He had 2 tours of duty. He was a helicopter pilot. My father was very brave, very focused, held himself to an excruciatingly high standard. He left the military. They tried very hard to keep him in, but mental health issues caused him to need to leave the military. And he went into financial planning, and he did so well that he retired at 48. He was very good at everything he did. And then at that point, he got involved with art and with the sailing community, and he became a racing sailor down in Corpus Christi. And then he started to take a few classes in art, a wide variety from different community agencies. And through his art, he began to dissect the trauma from the war. In fact, he went back to school. While he was in the military, he also got a master's in business administration. But he went back to school and got a Bachelor of Fine Arts, and he had a very dramatic show, which is typical of at the end of your Bachelor of Fine Arts. And then he created an art studio in Corpus Christi that did just clay. And they just had a reopening in January that I've been involved with going down and participating in their opening and sharing information about my dad and artifacts. All of the last 15 boxes of his life ended up on my doorstep in August of 2024. And I had to sort through it, but I had to get permission from my sister. My mother and father divorced after 33 years of marriage, and my mother could no longer tolerate the violence. That was when he moved to Corpus Christi. All of his stuff ended up at my house, and I had to figure out how to go through it so that I didn't offend anyone in the family, but still clean it up so that I could share the wealth with my daughter and my niece and my nephew. My sister and I are no contact at this point. She's an alcoholic, not in recovery. And she has 2 children who are also alcoholics, and one is an addict.
Was there violence in the household when you were a kid?
There was.
Yeah. And where are you with your in the order of your siblings?
I'm the oldest of 2 girls.
And was it verbal, physical abuse that went on, or?
To my sister and I, it was primarily verbal, and the physical violence tended to happen at night, overnight, so we could hear it. So I learned at a very young age to sleep very, very deeply so that I didn't have to become involved.
No kid should have to endure that. What did you think was going on whenever that happened?
You know, I didn't think at all when that was going on.
Kind of checked out?
I definitely checked out. I hid. I buried myself under the covers. I tried to not know because I didn't know how to deal with it.
And how much younger is your sister than you?
3.5 years.
So there came a point at which the 2 of you might be able to process what was going on together. What were you and she talking about with regard to your parents' behavior?
Unfortunately, I can't say that my sister and I ever had a good relationship. We didn't have a good connection. I kept hoping over the years that maybe when she had children after I had mine, that would be the key, or when she became a teacher because I was a teacher and my aunt was a teacher and our grandmother was a teacher. I kept thinking there was going to be something somewhere that was going to bring us together. Even my father's death didn't do that.
And when did your father die?
2008.
I had the same sort of things with the estrangement of a brother I haven't seen or had any contact with in over 40 years, and a younger sister who basically cut the family off at a certain point, so that my older sister and I are the only 2 who have any kind of relationship out of that. But it all stemmed out of those early childhood things that went on, and you don't figure them out until much, much later.
Correct.
It's amazing how short a period all that happened and how long a period it takes to get over it.
It's true.
You found that to be the case?
Absolutely.
So you had this situation growing up. When do you recall having had your first drink of alcohol?
I was offered alcohol from a very, very young age by all of the adults in my family. My mother's family there were many alcoholics. My father's family, his siblings. So there was always drinking at meals. And they would often, do you want to taste this wine? Do you want to? I never did. I wouldn't even taste it. I thought it smelled terrible. I hated it. My father was, he was a guy, and he really had hoped for boys, and he wanted to wrestle sometimes, and I could not stand the smell of the bourbon on his breath. It just was nauseating to me. I never drank bourbon. I just hated the way it smelled. And it was a precursor to something was going to happen.
So you had the opportunity to watch your dad from the point at which he started to drink until he got drunk. Did he pass out whenever he drank?
I don't recall him ever passing out, but that doesn't mean he didn't.
It's tough when they don't, because usually that means that whatever's going on is going to happen for a much longer period of time.
Exactly.
You'd rather have him pass out, right?
Exactly.
Certainly. Was your dad a binge drinker, or like an everyday?
In the Army at that time, it was expected. So it was every day. And at one point when we lived in Alabama, I think, he was chief of protocol. And so he had 3, 4, 5 events a week. Everybody drank. When they had parties at their house, everybody drank. And they didn't drink quietly. They drank.
Boisterous.
To say the least.
Did you guys move around as a result of your dad's being in the Army?
We moved so much you wouldn't believe it.
Certainly it's difficult for children to have to go through move after move after move. I've interviewed people that were in military families, several people in our club right now, who talk about having moved every 1 or 2 years and the difficulty of that. What sort of difficulties did you face as a result?
I had been to 8 schools by the time I got to 3rd grade. And then we continued to move, but a little bit farther spaced apart. One of the schools was down in Argentina, which is where my mom and my sister and I ended up when my dad took his first tour of duty to Vietnam. Her dad was in the land business, landman for the oil companies, and he was sent down to Argentina. So my mom took my sister and I to live with them for a year. So I had to learn to speak Spanish. It was very hard. I lost some schooling because of the difference in the North Hemisphere and South Hemisphere. And then I lost it when I came back. Sometimes we were in one place for 6 weeks. I went to 3 5th grades. I went to 3 1st grades. But like by the time I got to 6th grade, we were in Oklahoma, and I did the end of 6th grade and all of 7th. And then we moved someplace for 8th, and then we were 9th, 10th, and most of 11th in Coppers Cove, Texas. My dad was at Fort Hood. And then I moved the last 6 weeks of my junior year down to Corpus Christi, and I graduated down there.
That's a lot of moving in a relatively short amount of time.
It's a lot of moving. You know, I have friends that tolerated it very well.
Yeah.
My sister tolerated it much better than I did. I was a very quiet, very shy, very afraid person, and often had reports that the teacher would say, well, she won't raise her hand and she won't go to the board. I didn't know what to do but close off. So that's what I did.
That's unfortunate. You know, one of the things that I know from my own experience of having moved a number of times when I was a kid, but listening to what happens to other kids, especially those who come from military families, is they either get really, really good at making and losing friends, and they get pretty adept at making friends, and then when they have to move, severing those ties and just moving on. How did that whole process play out for you?
I didn't get good at making connections at all, and I continued that pattern as an adult. So when I came into AA and began to see what connections looked like and learn different ways to make connections, a whole world opened up to me. And I can't say it was a new world because I had no world before. I was completely shuttered in. And now I have connections, and it's the most amazing thing. I cannot believe how good life is because I didn't know how to process any of it.
I can imagine. When you're taking that frame of mind from being a child to adolescence and then into adulthood, you mentioned you were able to stay down in Corpus until you graduated. What came next?
I went to college at St. Edward's in Austin for a year and a half. Military bases, the people are really good at making friends with anybody coming and going because everybody's coming and going all the time. Corpus Christi has a naval air station, but the pilots are young guys, so they don't have anyone in high school.
Oh, yeah.
So there's not a sense of people making a lot of connections and letting new people into their groups.
Yeah.
They had friends from elementary, kindergarten. That was all they needed. They didn't need to make room for anybody else. I made a small group of friends, and one of those people I ended up getting in a relationship with and left school and went back down to Corpus to get married and worked, and then went back to school and finished my degree when my daughter was 2. I ended up working with children almost always. I worked in daycare centers as assistant directors. I worked in early childhood intervention. I worked in private schools, and then that population shifted and I had to leave. So I ended up going back to school, and I could get a bachelor's in education, but for many hours less, I could get a master's in education. So I went ahead and pursued my master's in early childhood education.
What drove your interest in early childhood education?
I think I wanted to help kids who were just like me. I think I wanted to help kids who were just a little bit behind, who couldn't quite make the connections, the mental connections that they needed to, that there had to be other ways for people to learn than the ways that were presented to me as a child.
So is it safe to say that even at that point in your life, many years before you ever came into AA, you found a way to be of service to other people who had gone through what you went through?
Absolutely.
That's a great basis to be an alcoholic from who gets into recovery. Yeah, I get that. So you just came into the program, let's say about 4 years ago, and so there's a chunk of time between when it was that you got your degree and started your career, your teaching career, having children and seeing them grow and having grandkids and all that other good stuff. How would you characterize those years in between? Because it is a lot of years in between.
It is.
And anytime I talk to or interview somebody who hasn't gotten sober until considerably later in life, sometimes after they retire, there's a large chunk of their life that worked out okay until they became alcoholic. And that happens somewhere along the way. Could you fill me in on what that looked like in your life?
Sure. I've been married twice, and my first husband was the young man that I knew in high school. At 13 years, he decided that he was going to move on. I was devastated because I wasn't smart enough to see that coming. I wasn't willing to see that coming. We had gotten involved in the sailing community, and we raced on Wednesday nights and on weekend regattas. And anybody who's really been a sailor knows that there's a lot of drinking on those boats. And so it was not uncommon that drinking would happen at that point, on Wednesday nights especially, and then during weekend regattas. We made a lot of friends, but my connection with the friends wasn't such that there was anything that carried over after he left the marriage, because all the friends that we had were his friends from high school and then sailing friends that we had mutually, but it's so awkward when people get divorced. And I met my second husband, and I got him involved in sailing, and we got a ride on a different boat, and because he was such a good alcoholic, there was always alcohol in our house. My first marriage, there wasn't a lot of alcohol. We didn't keep anything in the house. It wasn't on every weekend deal. But my second husband, it was already every night, especially on weekends. Anytime we went to the beach or went skiing on the rivers or whatever, there was always more than enough. So I gradually progressed, and what I found was that I was not a good drinker. I created chaos, just like many of us. But it was tolerated until it wasn't.
Is that because everybody else was doing the same amount of drinking as you were?
Yes. What it was is I was trying to keep up with all of them. They were all much better drinkers than I was.
But your behavior changed significantly as compared to them?
Significantly. And so over the years, it got worse and worse, and I became less and less social, and he was extremely social. And it became more and more of a problem, my drinking, because I pull back, whereas he goes forward into social situations. We ended up moving to Dallas, and I taught for 2 years, and then I went back to school and got a degree in occupational therapy at Texas Women's University, and went into that. And I just loved working with. I thought I would end up with children, but I actually ended up working with a lot of people as they were aging, and I really enjoyed it. And I found that as the door opens for children, the opposite happens as we age and things start to fall away. And I found a lot of parallels. So I knew how to address so many of them because I had seen it coming from the beginning. So I was more aware of strategies to use toward the end.
That's an interesting perspective, too.
It was really helpful.
So how many years did you do that for?
Only 5. I got my second master's at 50. And then my daughter got pregnant, and I was like, we're moving, because 4 hours from Dallas to Houston was too much, and I wasn't going to get enough grandkid time. And I'd waited for years for her to be ready to have a baby.
Back up for just a minute and tell me a little bit about your children. Were you still drinking when you had them, and after you had them, what did that part of your life look like?
I have one daughter from my first marriage. My second husband had 2 children who were 5 and 7 when we got married.
Okay.
So they were a part of every decision we ever made.
So you were a mother and a stepmother.
I was a mother and a stepmother. And it definitely impacted those kids. The amends have been profound and ongoing, because I can see so much damage that I did. I was very, very angry still as a drinker, and that was when it would come out. I would not define my boundaries. And I would hold it all in until the dam broke, and then, boy, everybody needed to get away, because it was, I don't know that I was always violent, but there were things that were thrown or broken, or it was ugly.
And kids need to get out of the way of that sort of thing, don't they?
They do. And I was creating the same atmosphere that I grew up in, and I hated that.
Whenever things kind of built up for you, was there ever a flashback at any kind of connection in your mind to, I'm doing this, I don't know why I'm doing it, wait, I think I do, my childhood? Did any of that ever come up for you?
I think I had buried all of that. I think I had stuffed it down into a cellar and closed that door, and I don't think I let any of that out. In fact, that was one of the things that when I went into therapy after the first divorce, I found that I was having to open that cellar and pull out a whole lot of stuff that I absolutely had never dealt with.
Yeah. Did the therapist who you saw after your first divorce, you were drinking at that point?
I was.
Were you drinking alcoholically?
I was binge drinking at that point.
Did that person know about it, and did they give you any feedback?
Neither one of the therapists that I ever worked with ever asked me directly so that I couldn't get out of it. They might have hinted at, do you drink? How do you think you have a problem with drinking? But they never got in my face, so to speak, to say, let's be real. You really need to tell me, how much do you drink?
It's all self-reported, right?
It was all self-report, and I was ashamed because I knew was that I was on the road to being an alcoholic, but I wasn't even willing to look at that.
Or the fact that you couldn't look at it or wouldn't look at it was your confirmation that maybe there is something wrong.
Exactly.
But a certain amount of drinking after that point will bury it down again, won't it?
It will, until I misbehave. And the only reason my misbehavior ever caused a problem, especially in the second marriage, was when it caused a problem for him. If my misbehavior didn't cause a problem for him, he was fine with it.
Was he a drinker too?
Oh, heavens, yes.
An alcoholic?
Absolutely. Still is. He's still drinking like a frat boy.
So is it safe to say your daughter got what she got from you and from him? Was it simultaneous, or was it as a result of you and your ex-husband clashing?
I'll have to think about that. I honestly can't. I haven't processed that yet.
Yeah.
I think it was mostly me, but she definitely dislikes her former stepfather. Definitely has some negative feelings around him and his behaviors and stuff. Yeah.
That's tough. Yeah, I know growing up for me that part of the problem was my dad was a rageaholic and my mother was kind of emotionally absent. So as the violence was going on, we never had an advocate. We never had a shield from my dad via my mother. And I can remember even as an early teen and adolescence begging my mother to divorce my dad because that, in my mind at the time, thought was the only solution. And of course, kids have a hard time understanding that relation, the toxicity and some of the dysfunction. And I guess I was just one of those as well. Sounds to me like your daughter was getting it from both ends.
She was.
Caught in the middle.
She was very caught in the middle.
Did she experience issues with drugs or alcohol or other aberrant behaviors?
I think that she experimented with them in college. And I know that she has been a drinker, but not like me. Mm-hmm. But I think that she chose an alcoholic to marry who has an alcoholic family. So the family tradition, my aunt jokes that if you're in our family, you're either going to be an alcoholic or you're going to marry an alcoholic. And I've done both. So
this is going on for literally years. How long were you married to your second husband?
25 years.
25 years. So it included the raising of your daughter and his too?
Yes.
How soon after they graduated from high school, until you were empty nesters, let's say?
When my daughter left for school, we had a place at the lake in Corpus Christi. So, and at the time, my ex-husband traveled a lot. So I was home in a 4-bedroom house, and I was going to be alone a lot. And I wanted to live someplace smaller. So we moved to our lake house. When his son graduated from high school, he waffled around a bit. He finally did graduate, and then he joined the Air Force. So he's currently in the Air Force, and he has a family of 3. My stepdaughter immediately joined the Army. She knew that college was not what she was interested in at the time. She was a military police when she was in the Army. She was in Korea. She got out. She is a very active woman, very strong woman. She actually is working in the Ukraine as an EMT right now. So that's very scary. It was scary when she was in Korea, and it's scary that she's in the Ukraine. But she's just not afraid to take the bull by the horns, that's for sure.
Yeah. Seems like the military has kind of been a trend in your family.
My first husband's father was in the Navy, so yeah, there's definitely a line along there.
We'll be right back. My friends, if you're enjoying AA Recovery interviews, I invite you to check out my latest audiobook, Alcoholics Anonymous, the story of how more than 100 men have recovered from alcoholism. This is the word-for-word, cover-to-cover reading of the first edition of the Big Book, published in 1939. It's a relaxing yet meaningful and engaging way to listen to the Big Book anytime, any place. Have a free listen at Audible, iTunes, or Amazon. While you're there, search for my other audiobook, Lost Stories of the Big Book, 30 original stories from the first and or second editions missing from the third and fourth editions of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's an engaging audiobook that brings these stories to life for AA members who've never seen them. These timeless testimonials were originally cut to make room for newer stories in the third and fourth editions. But their vitally important messages of hope are as meaningful today as they were when they were first published. Many listeners will hear these stories for the very first time. It's also available from Amazon as a Kindle book or in paperback if you'd like to read along. You're going to love it. And we're back. So there's alcoholism that runs back in the generations in your family.
Yes.
In your second husband and your first husband's family.
Yes, I believe so.
So there's a lot of alcoholism floating around out there in your background. At what point while you were drinking in these intervening years, when you were raising the kids, at what point did you first notice problems with your drinking that might have got you thinking, maybe I ought to cut down or stop?
I thought about cutting down a lot. I never thought about stopping. I don't think I fully embraced that concept until we were complete empty nesters when we moved to Dallas, which was in 2012, when we moved to College Station to be closer but not too close to the grandson. Mm-hmm. It was very obvious. I was hungover every single day. I was not one who ever took alcohol to work with me or got alcohol while I was at work. When you're a teacher, you're lucky if you get a bathroom break, let alone lunch. Mm-hmm. I worked really hard. As a classroom teacher, I worked 6:30 to 6:30, so by the time I got home, I was really wiped out, really tired, had more work to do, and I would sit down with a glass of wine, turned into a bottle of wine. When I moved to Bryan College Station, it was even more clear that I had big issues. By that point, I was a blackout drinker every night. I would wake up in the morning and somebody would have trashed my kitchen. And what had happened is I had fallen asleep, gotten up, gone to cook, and just left a horrendous mess. Luckily, I never burned the house down.
So you were blacking out every time you drank, or most times?
I would say every time.
Every time.
Mm-hmm.
Somewhere along the line, sometimes people catch themselves and say, wait a second, this just doesn't make sense. What were you saying to yourself to try and make it make sense? Because obviously you kept on doing it.
I did keep on doing it because I didn't know that there was a different way. I couldn't figure it out. And you would think that I would, I'm not completely dumb. You would think I could figure it out, but I didn't. I didn't even look at it until I got to the point where I started to feel suicidal. And then when I started to feel suicidal, that was when I went, whoa, I'm not going to do this to my family again. I can't afford to do this to my family again. So I began to formulate a plan.
So you were getting ready to check out so you would not inflict any more damage on your family.
But the checking out would have caused damage.
Yeah, I get that, yeah.
So I felt stuck.
Stuck.
I realized that if I wanted to not check out, I had to make a major change. And the only thing that I knew to do, because buried back in the back of my head were all of those daily readings that I used to do about, one day at a time, and there is a different way. And I really turned my back on whatever concept of God, which was not strong when my father died. And so I realized as I was trying to come into the program that I was going to have to refigure that. And I have just now got to the point where I can say I have a higher power, because I was really mad that my father went in such a horrible way.
That's really astonishing that it would take that many years, but you finally got it, and the reason you got it is because you came into AA. I'm curious as to whether your dad, with his 20-plus years in the program before he passed, what he might have said to you or observed out loud to you about your own drinking, and did he ever try to introduce you to a different way of doing things?
He never did. I do remember when he tried to make amends to me once, and I don't know exactly where he was in his program, but it was when he first moved to Corpus Christi.
Mm-hmm.
So he was fairly new in AA. I don't know if he had guidance from his sponsor on how to make amends, but I remember being very offended because he was like, I'm sorry, yeah, these things happen, and that was kind of it. I mean, that wasn't what I needed to hear for any healing from me. I guess I was always mad at my dad because of our life, because of the moves, because of the violence, because of the drinking. I never had a good relationship with my dad that I can say. So I can't say that as an adult I ever sought out any time with him. We would celebrate holidays together. We lived in the same town, but we didn't get together. And by the time I was with my second husband, there was always drinking. He was always drinking before, but now my second husband was always drinking by the time my dad stopped drinking, so that was not it just never, there was never a connection.
Yeah, that's sad too.
It is. It's heartbreaking.
Now, you say you've done some of your amends in your sobriety.
Yes.
When you went to do those amends, or when you were planning to do them with your sponsor, did you have any flashbacks to when your dad was trying to make the amends? Did you draw any connection between the way you were feeling as the amendor versus the amendee?
I definitely did. It definitely shaped my amends, and I made sure that going into any amends, I was very clear on what my part was.
Right.
And that I owned my part, that I didn't just offer words, that I offered sincerity.
How did you keep the anger out of it?
I didn't have any anger.
Towards your dad?
Well, I didn't make amends to him. He was already gone. So my amends have been to him through writing letters. The art studios, as I've driven back and forth to Corpus, I think about him extensively and basically have conversations in my head with him about it, because that's all I have at this point. I wasted. I let things get to a point where I wasn't able to do those things then, but I can do it now, and I am doing it now.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And so the amends that you made...
But to my stepkids, I did.
You did?
Yeah.
And how did all those work out?
They seemed to work out okay.
Yeah.
I tried to really be clear about how much I impacted them and the negativity, the not being available. I was very harsh.
How old were they when you got married?
My stepson was 7 and my stepdaughter was 5.
Okay, so they would have gotten some of what your daughter got all of.
Yes.
So maybe making amends to your daughter carries that plus a little bit more.
Plus a lot more.
Plus a lot. Well, as one who's had the opportunity to do it myself and take others through it, it is a process that can be like super painful.
Sure.
And bring up a lot of issues, a lot of justification, a lot of things that have their place in amends, some that don't. And that's where the help of a good sponsor makes a difference. And I know your sponsor. And I know that you'll get through that.
I will.
So as things were starting to really deteriorate, before 4 years ago when you came in, what was the period that really drove you into AA? Was it a gradual, or there's a lot going on at the last part of your alcoholism? There
was a lot at the last part. Initially, while I was drinking, I did drive drunk. How I didn't hurt myself or anyone else, I don't know. I never even got a ticket or anything. Mm-hmm. I was being watched, for sure. One morning when we lived in Dallas, I inadvertently, and it truly was an accident, took an Ambien instead of my antidepressant because it was the same shaped little white pill. And I drove.
Did you know that after you took it?
I didn't. And I fell asleep at the wheel, and I drove into a bridge abutment, And I didn't hurt anybody, and I didn't hurt myself, but I really messed up my car. And that was a huge thing from that point on, I never drove drunk. So if I didn't have a driver, I didn't drink.
Mm-hmm.
If I was going to go meet friends somewhere or do something, because that was just the most awful experience. In March of 2021, we were living in Bryan College Station, and my husband had got tickets for us for the Texas Independence Day. And we went down to Navasota, Texas, and it's a fun little town, kind of artsy, and a lot of Texas history. And I drank very excessively. And I was ready to go home before the headliner came on. And he was not willing to do that, but he said, you can just go lay down in the car, because as long as I was drunk, he didn't care. But when I became a problem was when it was a problem.
Right.
And it was going to impact his ability to see the headliner. And so I got mad, and I went and laid down in the car briefly, and people were walking by on the sidewalks, and they could see me, and they could clearly tell that I was drunk. And so I decided, I'm going to move the car because I don't want anybody to see me. And then I decided, if I can move the car, I can just drive home, which was one of the scariest things I've ever done in my life, because I was afraid I was going to hurt myself or someone else. And that was the breaking point. I was insane, and I knew I was insane.
So you knew that at the point at which you're driving?
I'm driving crazy drunk.
There were no voices in your head that said, just pull over, take it easy. You just went on.
I just kept going. And I got up the next morning, and see, he's stranded in Navasota, Texas.
Yeah, that must have freaked him out to go looking for the car and you and not see you.
It did. And then he had to get an Uber that had to drive from College Station, because they don't have a lot of them in Navasota, Texas. So he was pretty angry. But that was the point where I got up the next morning very, very early and drove to Houston and started looking for an apartment, because I knew a change had to happen. And the only way I could change is if I wasn't with an alcoholic, because he was never going to his demons who were alcoholics weren't going to let me get sober. It wasn't going to happen.
And as codependent as we often are as alcoholics, there's always a good chance that we're going to stay alcoholic and continue that behavior because of that codependency. It's a convenient place to kind of park your resentments, but it sounds to me like you at least took some geographic change.
And Houston was never my goal, but my grandson was here, and I was going to have a granddaughter. And so that made it very easy for me to choose Houston, Texas. My stepdaughter lived in Washington State, and my stepson, he was in Las Vegas, I think, at the time, and then he's since been in Del Rio, and they're in Albuquerque, and he's about to head to England. So, they weren't going to be anywhere. They were going to keep going. From April 1st to July 21st, I did still drink. I did not drive drunk. I wasn't a morning drinker, sometimes on the weekends, but I wasn't typically a morning drinker. But what would happen is I would show up at my daughter's house, and she could tell I'd had something to drink. And so she said something to my mother, and then my mother said something to me, because my daughter would have never said anything to me. And my mother said something to me, and I was incensed. And that also helped to drive me into the program.
Your anger over that?
Yeah, and I'm so grateful.
Was it an attitude of, I'll show her, or I'm going to do it despite her?
A little bit of both.
I get it.
A little bit of both. I was very upset.
It sounds to me like you came to that within a relatively short period of time before you literally stopped and went to AA.
I think it was very, very gradual until I fell off that cliff. And then I was serious about it.
Did you think of treatment, or did you immediately think of AA because of your own experience?
I didn't think of treatment. I didn't have any insurance at the time either.
Okay, well that makes the choice of that a lot easier. But you knew about AA.
I did.
You knew that your father had stayed sober.
I did.
When you went to your first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, what were you expecting?
I didn't know. When I got divorced the first time, my therapist had recommended I go to Al-Anon. Even though my first husband was not a drinker, there were a lot of behaviors. So I think that he had had drinking, and his parents were not alcoholic, but I think that he had learned a lot of alcoholic type behaviors. So my therapist had recommended that I go to Al-Anon, and I did for a while, just religiously. And I read the literature, and I was all about it. And then I found out about ACA, and I became involved with adult children of alcoholics, and I loved those meetings also. It never occurred to me to go to AA. It never did. So I had been to Al-Anon meetings and ACA meetings, but I really had no clue what an AA meeting would be like. And while it's very similar, it's not the same.
That's interesting because oftentimes, I know in the Al-Anon meetings I went to years ago, I was an alcoholic who was also in an Al-Anon, and though I had a little bit of difficulty with the nomenclature where I would accidentally say, my name is Howard, I'm an alcoholic. They don't like you to say that in an Al-Anon meeting. But there were enough other AAs in the room that whenever we would encounter somebody who was in the Al-Anon but not in AA, but whose demeanor and the things that they were saying would clearly indicate they could use AA, one of us from the Al-Anon side at that time would walk up to them and say, have you thought about AA? Did you have any of that when you were going to Al-Anon?
There was not a single AA in any of the meetings that I went to that I was aware of.
So here you are sitting there with your own problem of drinking and being an alcoholic.
But it wasn't terrible at that point. There was a little bit of binge drinking at that point, but it was pretty rare. It happened.
Yeah, so they didn't say anything to you about it at the time?
No.
Okay, so you have all this experience with 12-step programs up to the point at which you decide to stop. And you go to your first AA meeting, even though you'd been before, but let's say starting with this sobriety. What was that like? And what were your first days and weeks like in AA?
It was scary because it was really, really new, and I knew that it was the first day of the rest of my life, and I didn't know if I could do it.
And it was during COVID too, right?
It was during COVID,
yeah,
which was scary. But it was a women's meeting, which made it very comfortable. And the Al-Anon meetings that I'd gone to in Corpus Christi were in this little bitty, kind of beat up little house.
Mm-hmm.
So the 12 and 12 was in this little bitty, kind of beat up house. And so it felt like home. I'd gone to a lot of meetings. It probably was only over a year and a half or so, but I'd gone to a lot of meetings, 2 or 3 days a week easily.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't doing daily, but I was definitely getting relief there. I didn't want to speak up. I knew that when I first went into my first AA meeting, but it was with all women, and I knew we were going to lunch after, and I was looking forward to it. My aunt had moved away and was living down in the valley, and so a lot of the people that she had been to the meetings with were so excited to see her, and she had told them that she was, so we made a big table of like 14. So all of these people, I instantly had all of these people, and many of them came to the Zoom meetings also because I started going to the Zoom meetings that next week.
Now the live meetings were in Katy.
The live meeting was in Katy.
And that included your aunt who lived in the valley at the time?
Correct.
She came into town and went to the meeting with you?
She took me to a meeting, yeah.
That must have made a big difference for you.
I wouldn't have been able to go without her.
Really?
I don't think. I could go now by myself anywhere, but I couldn't have done it at the time. But I have courage now. I've uncovered it. I didn't have any courage then.
It's clear to me because I've seen you since whenever it was you started to come to this club, and I've seen a change even in that amount of time. What were you thinking when you walked out of that first meeting about your prospects of staying sober?
I didn't think that I could do it, but I was willing to give it a try. And between 60 days and 90 days, I had a crisis in the middle of the night. It was horrible. Up to that point, I got a lot of encouragement from my daily Zoom meetings. I met some great people. It was mixed. It was men and women. I loved it. I did my readings. I followed, the prescriptions that I was given to do the readings, to meditate. I was doing all of that work, but I still didn't believe I could do it. And I didn't know that I believed it until recently. I've always kind of been waiting for the other shoe to drop, and I fully accept that this is for one day at a time. With both my father's experience and my aunt's experience, I know that it can come at any time. But I think, as for today, I'm okay. I'm good with staying sober. I don't want to drink. I had to learn how to talk to myself differently. I'd drive home from work, and I'd pass like a Papacitos or something, and I'd think, oh, a margarita would be so good to sit down and eat chips and queso and a margarita. I wanted that so badly. And I'd have to say out loud, but I don't drink. Thank you, but I don't drink. I would have to repeat that in any form I could come up with over and over again so I could hear it, so that I would have it ready if somebody ever offered me a drink, that I would be able to say, oh, thanks, I don't drink. No, thank you, I don't drink. Oh, I don't drink. I would just over and over, I had to practice it because
had to get to be natural.
I had to be able to not have to think about it before it came out of my mouth. And I knew that about myself, that I had to have an answer because I tend to freeze up in social situations and I tend to go with old patterns. And so I had to have a new pattern in place.
So how did you prepare for the eventuality, and it almost happens to every alcoholic who is prepared with the thank you, I don't drink, when they keep pushing?
I haven't had that yet. But I haven't had a big social life, so that's fine. My daughter's family, even though my son-in-law drinks, I'm usually gone before late enough in the evening that I can really tell. When his family comes to town, we had Christmas together this year. About 4:30, his mother started hollering out that she was ready for somebody to fix her a drink. They had alcohol at the table, but everybody's clear that I'm not going to drink. I don't have to fuss about them having anything. It's not my house.
Yeah.
I'm okay with it. That's not my business. But I also know that when it gets to a certain point, I'm gone.
Yeah, that's important. And also, as important as that is, knowing that there's a good chance that if they ask you once, they might ask you twice. There's another thing that can happen, in my own experience, that is, where they start quizzing you about, oh, that's interesting, you don't drink. Do you have a problem with it? Or, they start asking the kind of questions that kind of back you into a corner. And then, oh man, I've known you for years, you've never been like that. And they're almost like trying to talk you out of the fact that you don't want to drink. And that's where whenever I talk to guys who have families where they say, well, my family knows I don't drink, so I feel safe there. I say, they may know it, but if they're not alcoholics, they don't understand it. And the fact that they don't understand what it is to be an alcoholic, they may say very innocently, oh, come on, why don't you have a drink? You never had a problem. Come on, one won't, and they can make it sound very enticing. And whenever that happens, in my mind, it's always 2 against 1. It's me and my alcoholism against my sober self. If that makes sense.
Right.
I really honor you in doing that and keeping the boundaries strong. Sounds to me like you've embraced the program, though. You talked earlier about some of the work that you're doing. When did you first get a sponsor?
It took me a while to get a sponsor. It took me about 3 weeks. I just didn't have the courage to approach a woman. And I didn't really want to do it from one of my Zoom friends, just because that felt still artificial to me. Finally, one of the women at the Saturday meeting, the face-to-face meeting, so then I started to go to the Promises meeting. And one of my fellows from the Zoom meeting also attended that. And I asked her if she would sponsor me.
She got you working the steps right away, and did you get to work right away?
We got to work right away. Then I had a Zoom sponsor. That was really hard to me to do the steps on Zoom. I missed the interpersonal part of that.
Well, I see you over here at this particular club, and usually what I do in the interviews is I don't identify the names of the clubs or any treatment centers for anonymity reasons, but let's just say that I've seen you come to this club and become a very active participant and doing a lot of service work. You seem to always be here early, and you have a tendency to stay late, which is what we always tell people. Come early, stay late, go out to lunch with people, go out to breakfast with people, call people, be available, put your hand up when people ask if you're available to be a sponsor. Speaking of which, are you sponsoring anybody right now?
I have 2 sponsees right now.
What's that been like for you?
It's been wonderful. I find that as a sponsor that my sponsees are my best teachers, but that's how I felt about being a teacher in the classroom,
Yeah.
that my students were my best teachers, that they taught me way more than any professor ever did or any book.
Mm-hmm.
My sponsees really helped me grow. I'm so grateful to have anybody. I mean, it's such an honor to have anybody even ask. I've had 4 previously, but they all really struggled really early on, and we never even got through the first few steps. But both of the ones I have right now are just, they're strong, amazing women, and they're quite different from each other, but I am just so impressed by both of them.
Do you notice a lot of similarities between them and yourself?
I think so, yes.
Well, I'm talking about the kind of issues that you're working with them on. Do you find that you have a lot of your own experience around the things that they need to work on?
Absolutely.
That to me is God putting people together right there.
Absolutely. I had to completely change the way I thought about everything because I was just full of self-pity and I was pathetic. It was hard, the hardest thing I've ever done. And I still can fall into it, but I can catch myself now too. And I don't have to get as far down, I don't have to wallow. But I do so many things, little tiny strategies here and there to catch myself. I'm at a meeting almost every day, if not every day. I do my readings, I do my meditations, I reach out to about 15 women every night and share my gratitude list.
Wow, that's great.
And I try to catch every woman who comes in new to the program to say, you know, I offer this, if you're interested, great, if you're not, great. And every so often I tell everyone that's on my group, you know, if you ever get tired of it, just say. It has nothing to do with you. There's no judgment.
It's just little service work you're doing.
I'm not even doing it as a service. I'm doing it because it's what I need to do. I need to focus on what's good happening to me today.
And it happens to inspire other people to do the same.
And it helps other people. But that's the secondary. And I've had people, like for one reason or another, like fall off of the list. And they'll text me within a few days, what happened? I need your list. And some people respond with their own list.
That's cool.
And some people don't. Some people comment. Some people don't. The only thing is I do it because it's what I need. I need people to know that there are things out there that I'm grateful for.
Well, and you just said it when you said that they'll send you their own lists. What you're doing is you're modeling how to do that. Because a lot of people are told they should do it, but they don't, until they actually see it in front of them, they don't get the idea. Sometimes it's just them copying what you're saying because they feel exactly the same way. But I can imagine what an impact that's had for you. What a great gift to be able to offer to them on a daily basis.
And it's so helpful to me.
And so helpful to you. So we've kind of come full circle to the fact that you're an active member of this club. You're here almost every single day. You're involved in sponsoring other women. You're involved in doing the daily things like prayer and meditation and reading and everything else. I wanted to ask you about your spiritual connectedness in AA and what that looked like from where you were to where you are.
When my father passed, I had no relationship with God. I stopped going to church when I was 13. And I was so angry at the deity, but I had to find something. So I started to learn about Buddhism. Mm-hmm. And I liked it because it was non-theistic. So I didn't have to have a person, a human-like figure, that it was the teachings. And it was all about being a good person. And so I really valued that. And that was my emphasis very strongly when my dad first died. And then I went and got my degree in occupational therapy, so I had to choose one or the other, and so that got pushed to the side a little bit because I had to put so much time into the other. And when I came in, I was still kind of ticked off at God. And then all of these gifts keep coming to me, and it's definitely a God thing.
Oh, yeah.
It's definitely all these God winks that I get, you know, from my father's stuff to end up at my house, all his artwork, all his photographs, all his awards from his artwork, all of his papers, all his medals, everything descended on my house. And I was the one that had to sort through it. And that was a huge nudge for me. It was huge. And then the clay studio reached out and asked me if I would come down for the soft opening. And I participated in that. And that was wonderful. And I met some great people. And I had lived in Corpus Christi for 30 years. So it was like going home, and I hadn't been back to Corpus Christi except for my father's funeral in 2008 at all. I hadn't been back. And that's where I lived the longest in my life. So much happened there in my life. Both my marriages, my daughter being born, graduating from high school, young adult, so much. And that was a breakthrough, going down. Just the going to Corpus, driving around. I went and looked at all the schools I taught at. I went and looked at all the houses that I lived in. All of these doors keep opening for me. After losing my mind, having to deal with my father's stuff, it was very, very, very hard. I didn't want to have to be the one that did it. I was the only one in Texas. My stepsister who dropped it off needed it out of her house. And so I was the logical recipient. But I didn't know how to go through it and respect my sister's wishes when I couldn't reach out to her. And then finding out, setting boundaries about how I needed to be able to do it. I need this out of my house by. So I need my mother and her sister, my aunt, to help communicate this to my sister so that I can know what I can do with this. Because I need it out of my garage and I need it out of my life. Well, it's still sitting in my house. But only the good stuff. You know, I went through all of his photographs and threw away all the negative stuff. I got rid of it. But everything that's left, I can send out to my niece and my nephew and to my stepson and to my stepdaughter the things that were good about my dad. And then I found an old scrapbook that my grandmother had created for my dad from his birth through the 60s. I found letters that he wrote from Vietnam and letters that people wrote to him in Vietnam from his first tour of duty. I had that whole scrapbook digitized by a member of our club so that I can share that with my daughter and my niece and my nephew, maybe my sister someday, so they can see a different side of him.
It sounds like an inspired thing to do.
All of this is a God thing.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you say that because that's really what it all ultimately boils down to. My feeling is we can choose to see God in things or not. You know, it's like I can choose to see God working in my life or I could choose not. I usually feel better when I choose it than when I don't. But there are some days when I'm just feeling whatever I'm feeling and think, I can't imagine how God's going to work in my life today. And then you get through the day and you think, maybe he didn't. But knowing that he did. So I hear what you're saying, and the fact that you're seeing God in that process of keeping the door open for your sister, maybe someday.
It's been wonderful. It's just been wonderful. And this is all just started in August. I mean, I wasn't ready for it to happen before then.
Yeah, so here you are sober 4 years, and this stuff is already happening.
And that's when I started to be able to really see it. I believed in a higher power. The two questions my aunt asked me before I came in were, do you believe that there is a power greater than yourself? Absolutely I do. I don't know what it is, but I absolutely did. Do you think that you are powerless? Yeah, clearly.
Yeah.
So those are my two bottom lines. That's a firm foundation for me to continue to build on. But now I do believe that I have a higher power, that I have a relationship with a higher power, that I can thank daily throughout the day, not just in the morning when I'm doing my readings or at night, all day long.
And to be an active witness of him working in your life.
In everybody's life around me, because I surround myself by the people in AA. Everybody in these rooms.
That's powerful.
It's beyond anything I could have imagined.
That's where that group of drunks, G-O-D, comes from. Right there, it's the fellowship.
It is the fellowship.
Well, you know, that's a great place to end here, Beth. I really appreciate you doing this, coming on, being part of the AA Recovery Interviews podcast. I never know who is going to hear what, when, and people all over the world are listening. But I like to feel that on any given day, at least one person has listened, and perhaps the podcast itself will have a positive effect on them, either getting sober, staying sober, getting through a hard time, or getting through a good time. And your story absolutely checked on each one of those items, and I just want to thank you for doing that. I love you. I appreciate your support in some of the things that you've helped me with personally. You're a great member of this club and a great member of AA, and I honor that, your sobriety, and say, keep it up, keep going.
Thank you.
Carry on.
It's been a wonderful experience. I really appreciate you asking.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Well, my friends, that's it for today's episode of AA Recovery Interviews. I want to thank my guest, Beth F., for sharing her story, and thank you for tuning in. If you've enjoyed the interviews in this podcast series, will you do a little service work by spreading the word about this rich and meaningful listening experience? This show is another helping hand of AA we can all extend to alcoholics everywhere. AA Recovery Interviews is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, and all other podcast providers. Or visit our website, aarecoveryinterviews.com, where you can listen to every episode of AA Recovery Interviews. And if you want to contact me directly with any comments or suggestions, simply email howard@aarecoveryinterviews.com. Please also take a minute to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. By the way, this podcast strictly adheres to AA's 12 traditions and all General Service Office guidelines for safeguarding anonymity online. I pay all production costs, and no one receives financial gain from the show. AA Recovery Interviews and my guests do not speak for or represent AA at large. This podcast is simply my way of giving back to AA that which has been so freely given to me. The next episode of AA Recovery Interviews is on the way, so keep coming back. It'll be here soon.